We move now to interpreting legislation. Now, what I'm going to give you is just the briefest explanation around this. There are books. I can't possibly emphasize how important, how crucial this is, and how many cases are all about what this word means and that phrase means and all that kind of stuff. But what I'm trying to do here is give you the practical tools without getting into all the academic stuff around it. Okay, the practical tools about how to interpret legislation. Now, I've given you, up until now, it's like the tools you'll need to be able to do this. You understand? So if you're not sure how to refer and read, etc., to legislation, this is going to be much more difficult. But if you've done that and you've covered that, then you'll find that that's what you'll learn now. So, first rule of interpreting legislation is that words must given their ordinary grammatical meaning. Now, I know it's English, and I know that is a problem. It's not always easy. But you can take a dictionary otherwise. So the ordinary word is what you're looking at. So what I'm saying to you there is you don't have to now go and look all outside or case law or whatever it is at the stage that we're talking about. You want to find out what a word means. You take that word and say, either if you don't know, not sure, use a dictionary, but what the word means. Okay? So, in that sense, very easy. But as I said, it can get a hell of a complicated. But anyway, the second rule. Now, this is my rule, because if you did this in a law school, otherwise like that, they would teach you something else entirely. But I think this is very key to understanding, because what I'm showing you is not just how the words, what the words mean, etc., but to understand how the Labour Relations Act in particular is actually put together, the logic behind it. Because once you click into that logic, you'll find it much easier to understand and being able to apply what we're dealing with here. All right. So I will teach you the first rule of interpretation. Exercise 9. Take your workbooks. It says, answer the following question. Must an employer always hold a disciplinary hearing before dismissing an employee? So I've given you the hint in your book there. Find the applicable law. I'm showing you, so you don't have to spend hours looking for that law. It's Schedule 8. Remember, I showed you where the schedules are, and I even said to you, just take note, because we're going to be using this quite a lot. And as I illustrated, I've got a little tag there because you use the Schedule 8. That's the Code of Good Practice. I also talked about Codes of Good Practice, and I said we're going to be looking at that. And then look for Item 4.1. Item 4.1. So if you need a pause, otherwise, I'm assuming you need to pause, then have a look at that. Well, the answer is Item 4.1 says normally the employer should conduct an investigation. Now, a little bit of a explanation here as well, because I said to you, must an employer always hold a disciplinary hearing? Well, the first thing is the Code of Good Practice doesn't refer to a disciplinary hearing as a disciplinary hearing. They refer to it as an investigation. Okay? So that's the first kind of practice, getting used to the terms used in the Labour Relations Act. But the other thing is what are the words? What does it say? Normally. So normally means most of the time. That's what it means. Quickly to explain the law there. All right. There are exceptions, very few exceptions to the situation that an employer must hold a disciplinary hearing. There are exceptions. But because there are, even though there are a few exceptions, the law says normally, which, as I said, means most of the time. Okay. Now that might surprise you, but that is the case. Normally means there are exceptions. You're not always obliged because of those few exceptions. Now, I'm not going into the law there. I just want you to understand how to interpret the first rule, use the first rule of interpretation. Exercise 10. Answer the following question. A client asks, when are my employees on strike? So, what I've put in your workbook as well. So basically what they're saying is, what does a strike mean? How do I know if they're on strike? Well, you'd have to find out what it means to be on strike. And then the thing is, like, well, hang on. Where in the Labour Relations Act does it tell us what words mean? I did mention it. If you don't remember what I said, I gave you a little bit of a hint there, then what I suggest you do is have a look through the contents of the Labour Relations Act that you've got until you find the definition section. All right? Have a look at what the definition of a strike is. Section 184 is about the right to strike. It's about the right to strike. Section 213 is the definition, where we find what the word strike means. Now, I haven't got it in my slides here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read what section 213, the definition section, when you get quite used to this, you realize definitions are in section 213. It says this, and I'm reading it because you will need this a little bit later, okay? Strike means the partial or complete concerted refusal to work, or the retardation or obstruction of work by persons who are or have been employed by the same employer or by different employers for the purpose of remedying a grievance or resolving a dispute in respect of any matter of mutual interest between employer and employee, and every reference to work in this definition includes overtime work, whether it is voluntary or compulsory. Wow. Okay. There's like a whole lot there. You go like, whew. You probably have to read that a few times to even begin to understand. But, okay, so the exercise is, what does a strike mean? If a client or somebody asks you, you say that's what a strike means. Now, the more you do this, you have more understanding of what a strike is, etc. Maybe you will down the line. But for the moment, we know that it's in the Act, it's defined in the Act, and that's what we look for. The other thing that I'm trying to teach you is you now don't make it up. You don't make up your own meaning of a strike. It's a word that has a specific meaning, a legal definition, which is in the Act. So don't make it up. Rather, look to the Act, find the definition, and then we'll use that. Great. Let's do the exercise. Illustrate the second rule of interpretation. It's to follow and apply the logic. Now, you have to bear with me here. This, I admit, it can be a little bit like, what do you say? Bear with me. You will learn a lot here. All right. So we're going to find and read item 7 of the Code of Good Practice dismissal. Answer the following. Logically speaking, what is the first and the second thing that any person who's determining whether a dismissal for misconduct is unfair, and to explain that, they're referring to a chairperson of an investigation, a disciplinary hearing. That's what they're referring to. What is the first thing and the second thing that any person who's determining whether a dismissal for misconduct is unfair, that's a chairperson, in fact an arbitrator as well, but for now we'll just deal with it as a chairperson should do. So you're probably going to have to read that a few times to be able to answer the question. And I'd like you to do that because it's important that you get the right answer and not waiting for me to tell you what the right answer is. So remember I said, what is the first thing? And logically, what was the first thing that person must consider? Well, logically, okay, well, maybe let's read that item together. Item 7, guidelines in cases of dismissal for misconduct. Any person who's determining whether a dismissal for misconduct is unfair should consider A. Whether or not the employee contravened a rule or standard regulating conduct in or of relevance to the workplace, and B. If a rule or standard was contravened, whether or not 1. The rule was valid or reasonable rule or standard. 2. The employee was aware or could possibly be expected to have been aware of the rule or standard. 3. The rule or standard had been consistently applied by the employer. And 4. Dismissal was the appropriate sanction for the contravention of the rule. Now, go back to the question. What is it telling you that this person who is determining whether dismissal for misconduct was unfair, which is chairperson or arbitrator, what is the first thing that they should look to? Well, I've given you the answer there, but it says, is there a workplace rule? Where do I get that from? Think about it logically. Should consider whether or not the employee contravened a rule or standard regulating conduct. Well, so the first thing you should consider is there a rule? It says there whether they contravened the rule, but by dint of logic, what is actually also saying, without saying that clearly, and that's the trouble with interpreting legislation, what it is saying is that there is a rule. That's what it's saying, because you can't contravene a rule if there's no rule. There must be a rule. And then secondly, logically now, if there is a rule, did they contravene the rule? So the logic is implicit in the way that this is written. Do you understand that? The logic, to understand and apply and interpret law, you've got to look at it, what it's saying, but also what it's inferring, and sometimes what it's not saying. Logically, there must be a workplace rule before an employee can be found to have contravened that rule. Does that make sense? I hope so, because this is quite key to understand there. So the logic is that before you can decide if an employee has contravened a rule, you must find out if there is a rule. So it's an implied logic. Right. 2. If the chairperson finds the employee did not contravene a workplace rule, what in terms of this item follows logically? Think about it. It said you've got to find the rule and then find out, see how it's a question, has he contravened the rule? And the section says, let's read it together, whether or not the employee contravened a rule or standard regulating conduct in or of relevance to the workplace, and if the rule or standard was contravened, whether or not. So logically, because it says if it was contravened, whether or not. So if it wasn't contravened, in other words, in simple terms, the employee was found not guilty, the employer says you came to work drunk, you investigate, you find he wasn't drunk, then the rest of it doesn't follow. Because it only follows if a rule or standard was contravened, then you go. Do you see that? I hope you see that. So nothing would happen. It would be found not guilty. Or if you're investigating the matter before holding, as I said, a preliminary type investigation, then what you would do is you would end it there. So the rest doesn't apply. Now again, it doesn't say that as like don't go to step 2 or whatever. But implicitly in the way the law is written, you will understand that that is the case. I hope. 3. What does should mean? Let's just have a look at it. Any person who is determining whether a dismissal for misconduct is unfair should. Should, what does that mean? Basically, you're required to do that. Okay? It says should. And in the sense, it's a kind of a recommendation. I mean, they could have said must do, it would have been clear. But they say should. And the reason why they say should, not must, is because this is the guideline, as I've said. A code of good practice is a guideline. So they're saying this is what you should do. But that's important to understand. What does contravene a rule mean? It means breaking the rule, committing misconduct. That's the ordinary meaning of the words. Now this is a little bit difficult. I've said to you what is the first and second thing that a chairperson should do. And we've worked that out using the logic. Is there a rule, first of all? Secondly, did he contravene the rule? So now, if, as we found out, if he has contravened the rule, in other words, committed the misconduct, or as we say, is guilty, then we move on to the third, fourth, and the things that must be considered. Then you must consider, if a rule or standard was contravened, whether or not, one, the rule was valid, or a reasonable standard a valid or reasonable rule or standard. Then you consider, and you see the logic here, the employee was aware, and thirdly, whether the rule or standard was consistent, and then lastly, whether dismissal is appropriate sanction. So what I'm trying to show to you is the logic there is clear. I mean, it was implicit before. You could say, now it's clear. You do this, 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 this. You move from one to the other. Does that make any sense? I put out the answer, right? Etc. So now the logic here is, it tells you what to do step by step. So the Code of Good Practice is a guideline, and it's helping you to work through a problem. And it's showing you, if you understand and reading it correctly, what to do step by step by step. Okay? Does that make sense? So, what have we learned here? The key learnings. To interpret legislation, including codes of good practice, apply the first rule of interpretation. What does a word mean? Look for the definition. Good thing to remember. There's probably a definition here. Go and look for a definition. Sometimes you'll use a dictionary. You need to see the logic, implicit and explicit, when we're reading legislation. You see the logic of the structure. You've got chapter, part, sections, and all that kind of thing. So it's all legislation, particular Labour Relations Act, great piece of well-written legislation from this point of view, is that the logic is explicit in the way it's written, structured, and then implicit often in the way that the sections and subsections and so on fit together. So we need to understand what the legislation actually means by unpacking the process, step by step, of what we have to do. And we're going to learn more about that. Going to move on to something which I call elements, which is my own way of moving on in terms of an understanding and helping anybody to deal with these kind of matters. All right.